Climate, People, and Environment Program weekly seminar series, or approximately weekly seminar series. I'm very happy today to introduce Professor Brian Henning. Brian is the inaugural director and founder of the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. Has been involved with the environmental sciences program at Gonzaga for a while as well. And so I was first made aware of, so in that sentence, the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment, you immediately start seeing words that ping me. Climate, water, environment, and then Gonzaga. As a lot of you know, I'm an alumni from Gonzaga University, and so I've been following Brian's work for several years now. And when the Gonzaga Institute for Climate was begun, I was very interested to see how that would kind of manifest. And I was very interested as well because Dr. Henning is a professor of environmental studies and a professor of philosophy. His background is in philosophy. From the onset, I was very intrigued with this, with some of the ideas that of thinking about how we interact with our environment and thinking of the philosophical groundings for environmental ethics, which is one of his areas of research as well, or work as well. Dr. Henning has written or edited 14 books and more than 35 articles and chapters. One of them is, one of the most recent ones I'm attempting to read through now. So, Value, Beauty, and Nature, the Philosophy of Organism and the Metaphysical Foundations of Environmental Ethics. This gives you, if you want some interesting reading and thinking about Whitehead's philosophy on organism, I'm out of my league here. So my attempt at explaining this, providing a grounding for how we think about our connections with the environment, with each other, and thinking of that as a basis for environmental ethics. So I'm very happy to have you here today. We'll be talking about fixing the climate crisis, changing our light bulbs and ourselves, and I presume we'll see some of the great work that's been going on with the Gonzaga Climate Institute as well. So,
thanks so much, man.
It's great to have you here.
Hi, everybody. So it's coming in okay in the back there? Excellent. Well, thanks for having me here again. We just hosted Dan at Gonzaga last week, so we're trading talks.
Yes,
so
yeah.
This is really lovely. Thanks for the good weather here in Madison. So this talk is based on a 2015 book called Riders in the Storm that I wrote for a general audience and delivering to different audiences. So this doesn't presuppose any given background. This is not a talk necessarily for philosophers. I'm hoping everybody gets something out of it. I am not, as Dan said, a scientist, although many of you are. So this is the really, really rough version of what a philosopher knows. So it's warming, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, we can fix it. So this is the Kimberly Nicholas came up with this, and it's a really helpful way of distilling it down for those of us who are not climate scientists. And a lot of thoughtful work goes into establishing, points 1 through 4, and debating about points 1 through 4. I'm interested as a philosopher in thinking together about what we mean by fixing it. Exactly what does that mean? What does that look like? What in our mind's eye do we picture a fix would look like? If we have the political will and the means, what would we want to create together? So part of this is motivated by the idea that how we fix problems is largely determined by what we think the problem is. So how we define the problem will come to also define what counts as a solution. So that's the first way of thinking about what we mean by a fix. The second is actually inspired by the first few minutes of a documentary that Naomi Klein did with her partner Avi Lewis based upon her book of the same title, This Changes Everything. So what I'd like to do is to show the first 5 minutes of that video to set up sort of a narrative context for my comments today, if the technology cooperates.
I've always kind of hated. Can I be honest with you? I've always kind of hated films about climate change. What is it about those vanishing glaciers and desperate polar bears that makes me want to click away? possible to be bored by the end of the world? It's not that I don't care what happens to polar bears. It's just that we're told that the cause isn't out there, it's in us. It's human nature. We're innately greedy and short-sighted. And if that's true, there is no hope. But when I finally stopped looking away, traveled into the heart of the crisis, met people on the front lines, I discovered so much of what I thought I knew was wrong. And I began to wonder, what if human nature isn't the problem? What if even greenhouse gases aren't the problem? What if the real problem is a story, one we've been telling ourselves for 400 years? This first struck me in the craziest place. I was in a stately home in the English countryside that looked an awful lot like Downton Abbey. It was an invitation-only meeting hosted by the world's oldest scientific organization, the Royal Society. Instead of ordering around the servants, the people here were trying to order around the sun. I mean the sun in the sky. They were discussing a plan to spray chemicals into the stratosphere to turn down the temperature for planet Earth.
What you need to do is put a small number of particles up in the upper part of the atmosphere. And those particles will deflect just a tiny bit of light. One garden hose to the sky could eliminate global warming for the entire northern hemisphere.
In other words, let's solve the problem of pollution with more pollution.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid. And if you're bearing the lead, is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the ass?
Here's the thing. This idea may be crazy, but it's also totally logical within the story that the Royal Society pioneered in the 17th century. Here's how it goes. The Earth is not, as most people thought back then, a mother to be feared and revered. No. Science had granted men godlike powers. The Earth is a machine, and we are its engineers, its masters. We can sculpt it like a country garden. We can extract from it whatever we want. These scientists help turn the mother into the motherlode. This story is where the long road to global warming began. When I realized that, I stopped tuning out those sad polar bears, because unlike human nature, stories are something we can change.
Okay, so Klein has this idea of trying to figure out how we got to this moment of crisis. She thinks that some would say it's human nature. On that story then, she notes that we're kind of doomed because presumably human nature is not something we can change. If we're just inherently greedy and destructive, well, there's no hope for us. But she doesn't think that it's caused just by human nature. She thinks, as she puts it, that it's, we're at this moment of ecological crisis because of, as she puts it, a story we've been telling about ourselves, to ourselves, about what we are and what we are in relationship to our planet. This story, she thinks, started at least 400 years ago with, as she uses the Royal Society, the idea that we're lords and masters of nature, we can do with it as we please, and that's that story that has gotten us to the problem that we're in right now. So I'd like to combine sort of my two narrative contexts here of what does it mean to fix it with three different stories, right? So Klein's idea is we need a better story, a new story, and so I'm thinking, well, what is a better story that would fix the problem? Does that combination make sense? So 3 different answers to the question, what's a better story that would fix the climate crisis? And perhaps the first and most common that we would say is, well, a better story is, instead of that we're lords of masters of nature, we need to become sustainable, right? A better story. And then, I'm not sure if you've dealt with philosophers before, but my kind will do this and then be like, what is sustainability? What do we mean by that? It's of course a very flexible plastic term that goes by lots of different definitions. So what I'm about to say is definitely not the only way that it could be defined. I'm thinking in particular of saying that within particularly popular and business contexts, surprisingly the Brundtland Commission definition is still, I think, the most common. I was just reading a host of sustainability business books, and time and again they still use this definition as the core understanding of sustainability. Something is sustainable if it can meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Seems like a pretty decent starting place. I mean, it would be awful to be doing things today that would make it impossible for the future to meet its needs. And so sustainability is really not an option, or it shouldn't be an option. That we're worried about sustainability is a really worrisome problem, because that implies that we are, in fact, maybe doing things today that will make it impossible for the future to meet its needs. But it doesn't necessarily come with a lot of explanation about exactly what does that look like if we did it. And so let's try to imagine, in your own mind, what do you picture in a world that is sustainable? What does that look like to you? What have we done if we did it? This was the headline in the USA Today on Earth Day in 2019. They asked this question: what would life be like after climate change? Would it be better than today or worse? Mud huts and gruel, or flying cars and the Jetsons? And so I assume that Mud huts and gruel doesn't sound so awesome, so I'm assuming that what we're hoping for is the Jetsons, right? So let's just play with that. Any Jetsons fan? Does anybody know heard of the Jetsons? My undergrads say they have. I don't know if that's just that the internet makes all things new or they're lying to me, but 1960s era, Hanna-Barbera depiction of what they thought a technological utopia would be in the year 2000. So we are rather depressingly 24 years past the future. In this bright, shiny Jetsons future that they were thinking of, right, what was their technological utopia? Well, first of all, in the future, in the utopia we want to create, professors like me and Dan have been replaced by TeachBot 5000 there, which doesn't unionize, doesn't require health benefits, and changing curriculum is really easy, so progress. It's coming to a school near you. Life, thankfully, is still centered on what's most important, which, as we all know, is buying stuff. So this is really a nice depiction of mid-20th century consumerism, post-World War II sort of era. My recollection of the opening montage of George Jetson giving his cash and credit card to his wife and daughter to go shopping. So it's a real nice depiction of that. And this is what the year 2000 looked like. If you were around for Y2K, this is... useful people like engineers, ask like, how would we create this? How would we create jetpacks and flying cars? Not being useful, philosophers don't have any contributions to those conversations. Instead, we ask things like, not how do we do this, but ought we to do this? Is this what we want to create? Is this what success looks like? And of course, that's a subjective question, but if we push a little bit on the Jetsons idea, I'm wondering to myself, like, what did we do down below that we're now like no longer on the planet? Apparently, in our wildest technological dreams, it involves no longer having access to or involvement with non-human parts of the world. There's just, as far as I know, the one dog. Anybody for extra points? The dog's name? Somebody said it. Astro. Very good. Gold star. So Astro. We're up above the planet. I don't know if there was some sort of disaster, but it's interesting to note that the perfect future is one in which involves no access to wild things if they're there. For me, if you scratch the surface of the Jetsons, what I think you end up actually with is something more like WALL-E. Any WALL-E fans out there? A few. So it's now getting to be a little bit old. If you haven't seen this, that's your homework for this weekend, is to stream WALL-E. So the premise is pretty simple. We ate it all. It's all gone. We consumed everything. There's nothing left on the planet except these nice little cute robots that compact our trash into nice cubes and stack it into piles. So these are piles of trash amidst, this is trash, this is a skyscraper to give you a sense of scale, right? There's nothing left. The planet is devoid of all life, but that's okay because we're not on the planet anymore. We're off in space. So this is another technological utopia. And in this technological utopia, it is awesome. First of all, you no longer have to walk because clearly walking is stupid. You only drink all your calories, and you only interact via screens, which when I was delivering this talk during the pandemic was a little close to home. I'm glad to be with you face to face. This is a great luxury. Going to the beach is interesting. So in this utopia, we have welcome to economy, buy, shop, live. Eat, shop, 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 buy, shop, live. BNL is not a nation or a group of nations. BNL is, what does it stand? Anybody remember what it stands for? By and large. So it's like a spoof on Walmart or today Amazon. It's run by a giant corporation, right? You only drink all your calories. You live to buy, shop, and eat. Okay, what's my point? In thinking about this, watching it 10,000 times with my children, I realized that at a certain point, this arguably meets the Brundtland Commission definition of sustainability. Because what occurred to me is that we have not just recently been in space, but we've actually been in space for generations, maybe for centuries, which means we figured out our problems with energy and waste. We did it. We figured that out. We apparently could do this indefinitely. What I'm not sure about is whether or not this is good. What kind of occurs to me is that the WALL-E future for me represents a future which is sustainable, but not necessarily good. And if we can have futures which are sustainable but not good, is sustainability by itself a sufficient story to define what counts as fixing it? Is that making some sense? It, of course, completely depends on how you define sustainability, and there are absolutely more robust definitions of sustainability, for sure. As a side footnote, I would also suggest that, so as important as sustainability is, and it is super important because the opposite of sustainability is being dead, I think it's also interesting to note that in this WALL-E future, it's also possible to create a future that's not only sustainable with respect to energy and waste, but is also equitable. We could imagine creating a future in which no one bears disproportionate environmental benefits or burdens. Everyone has equal access to power. It's perfectly environmentally just. I think arguably you could say this is that, but if it's not, we could change the thought experiment and just stipulate that it is. But again, so there seems to be that we could have futures which are sustainable and even equitable, but not good. And this is not me attacking either of those notions. It's simply me pointing out that if we're really saying what counts as the fix that we all want, are we aiming high enough? Or are we, in fact, going to be settling for things which could be still not good? There are too many futures, to my mind, which are sustainable and equitable, but not, in fact, good or good enough. But because I'm a philosopher, I'm contractually not allowed to leave it in that pretty tight, clear way. I have to make it unnecessarily complicated, so I'll put it in these three ways. Sustainability, as it's typically defined, frequently is anthropocentric. It tends to be concerned about present and future humans, and although I am pro-human, for the record, there are also all sorts of other cool things on the planet that are also pretty neat that I'm interested in protecting. Secondly, it tends to be technocratic. It tends to see our problems of pollution to be problems to be managed through the development and deployment of technology. There's no underlying conceptual value problem. There's just simply the need to deploy the right set of technologies. In the video, the guy was like, one guard knows to this guy. Right, that guy? That's a good technocratic sort of approach. Like, well, all we need to do is keep managing the problem faster and faster. And then third, I actually don't think that the Brundtland Commission definition is actually a moral concept at all in its root. sustainability is really just about things that can be done indefinitely, processes that can be done indefinitely into the future, that they presuppose we know what is good. They don't tell us a way of figuring out what is good. They say, make good things sustainable without explaining how to figure out which things are good. Does that make sense? That's a problem, because if we don't have a way of defining what's good, what invariably happens is that the status quo is very happy to explain what is good, and then we're just sort of left with this idea of, well, I guess we're just trying to make conceptions of consumption sustainable, which is thin, I would suggest. Doesn't particularly make those who are winners or losers meaningfully happy, or as philosophers have been trying to argue for the last 2,500 years or so. So, sustainability is a really useful concept, but I'm not sure it's enough, so maybe what we need is to move beyond that. And so some have suggested that perhaps what we could do is to add the notion of stewardship to the notion of sustainability. And that's the second story that I wanted to consider together. What is that though, right? So the idea of stewardship is frequently used in our relationship, especially to the land. So what do we mean by this? What exactly does that look like? And if you were having any doubts about whether I'm a giant nerd, I will allay those concerns or doubts and establish very clearly, yes, I absolutely am a giant nerd. What is stewardship? Okay, so I'm going to use Tolkien. Any Tolkien fans? Lord of the Rings? Okay, fellow nerds, excellent. Watch, the movies are pretty good, books are better. So, third of the trilogy, Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, is about a kingdom of Gondor, which is on the edge of hostile territory, Mordor. It's always in danger of being overrun by the forces of Mordor, but for many generations have been led by benevolent kings in the line of Numenor, blessed with long life, right? But the last of the kings had gone to play ranger in the north and left the care of the kingdom to Steward of Gondor, right? So Steward of Gondor, Denethor, the 26th Steward of Gondor. What does it mean to say that he's the steward? So we're trying to get at this notion of what do we mean by stewardship? What is that? If Denethor is the steward, what does that mean he is? Can't see very well in this picture, but above and behind him are steps going up to the king's throne. He's not on the throne, he's on the ground. He's got a fancy chair, but he's just the steward. Stewardship seems to imply the idea that you have responsibility to care for something, but it's not yours. It dislodges the ownership idea that Naomi Klein was talking about, this idea that we're lords and masters of nature, we can do with it as we please. The stewardship metaphor says, not so fast. If you're a steward, you have the responsibility to care for something, but it's not yours. It's not Denethor's kingdom, it's not his people, it's not his land, it's the king's kingdom, it's the king's land. So it's responsibility to care for something on behalf of another. And that other, that on behalf of another, can take lots of different forms. For some people, it's the creator. For other people, it might be future generations. For others still, it could be on behalf of nature itself. So on behalf of what are you a steward can vary based upon your own underlying framework. So are we to our planet what Denethor is to Gondor? That's the basic analogy. In some ways, I want to suggest yes, in that if you know the books and the movie, you know that Denethor sucks at his job. He lights himself on fire and runs off the precipice in dramatic fashion. So we are doing that right now. So that seems fairly accurate. So that tracks. We are doing that. I want to suggest that there are, of course, more shallow and more engaged versions of these two things. Then if we want to deepen our notion of sustainability and stewardship, we can have them do more work. And I think that is an improvement. I think the stewardship metaphor is a significant improvement. It's not competitive with sustainability. I want to suggest it could be combined with it and give it additional content. So those two stories added together are better than they are separate. We need to be sustainable. If we're not sustainable, nothing else matters because we're dead. If we're dead, not much else matters. But there are futures which are sustainable but not good, so we need to also be good stewards to see ourselves as responsible to care for the earth on behalf of others, on other things, other future generations at minimum. I think this is a significant improvement, but I still have a nagging worry, and this worry was given voice for me by Stephen Jay Gould, who in a piece in 1990 took what is kind of maybe a controversial position against stewardship. He noted, of course, it's well-intentioned, but that if we're looking for a better story, a story that defines what we are as a species in relationship to the planet on which we find ourselves, that the story of stewardship is misguided. It's not true. Because if you think of us within geological time or biological time, we arrived a few seconds ago, and by what measure could we be in charge of the Earth in the way that Denethor is in charge of Gondor, having just barely arrived? That is a misunderstanding of what we are in relationship to our planet. Our planet is 4.5 billion years old. The universe is, what, 13.8 billion years old. We arrived a few 100,000 years ago. We're like, we're in charge. You're welcome. We're here. We can steward the heck out of you. He's like, doesn't really track. And so I was working on this book project, and the original title was The Reluctant Steward, because this idea of like, well, what's the alternative? And I ended up writing it, and then there were like 3 pages on this concept of the reluctant steward, and my publisher was like, you write almost nothing about that, that's the title of the book. And I'm like, yeah, I think that whole framework just failed miserably. And thankfully, I found the work of a cultural historian, Thomas Berry, around the same time. What occurred to me is that the stewardship idea has frequently this idea of, if you say, what are you a steward of, you would point to something, like I'm a steward of that child, I'm a steward of that land, I'm a steward of that university, and you would point to something, the finger of stewardship, so to speak. What occurred to me was that maybe what we need to do is to become stewards, but of ourselves. So that it's more of a turning the finger of stewardship around and pointing it at ourselves rather than at nature. It's not clear to me that it needs us to fix it. In fact, the Army Corps of Engineers arguably has a long history of examples of screwing that proposition up. And so David Orr at Oberlin, I think, puts this point really better than I could, that we need to figure out ourselves. And so what I mean by not only changing our light bulbs, but ourselves is something like this. Yeah, we need to decarbonize energy and transportation in order to survive, but we really can't fix the problem unless we fix ourselves, which partly involves how we see ourselves in relationship to our planet. And that gets me to a third story, a third way of thinking about fixing it. And as I mentioned, this was inspired by the work of Thomas Berry, who argues that we are right now between stories. The old story that we got from places like the Royal Society saying that we're lords and masters of nature had broken down, but we don't really have a good alternative account yet of what's a better alternative story then. And he thinks this actually then is much of our work. He calls it the great work. He thinks that we need to take up this work of reconceiving of what we are at the species level. And that is in part a cultural, sociological, philosophical project, not merely a technological project. And if we really want to address the root of the problem, what we should be doing is aiming at creating a future in which we are in some ways living flourishing, equitable human societies within verdant, flourishing, biotic communities. That if we were truly having a fix that would be worthy of the name, that would be a situation wherein we would be mutually beneficial to the other forms of life on the planet. So many of you know how geologists lay out history. We were giving some of those examples with Gould's quote a minute ago. This is the last 500 million years or so. So to orient you, this is the present here. And so we have eras, periods, epochs, and ages. So the Cenozoic is our current era. So if you were to ask a geologist what time it was and they were being glib, they would say, Cenozoic, Quaternary, Holocene, right? Because they have weird watches. And so that's what time it is. That's the present. Many of you probably know what, the Holocene epoch is the epoch within which all of written human history has taken place. It's sort of our climactic normal. And now the argument is that we've prematurely ended this. There's a working group that's kind of making final determinations on this question, the Anthropocene Working Group, right? That's saying that we've now prematurely ended the Holocene and are entering into the Anthropocene, and then figuring out how to date that. Where did that start? When did the Holocene end? The Holocene should have continued for many thousands of years longer until Milankovitch cycles push us into another glacial, but we prematurely ended it, which is a big darn deal. So it's a momentous time. Thomas Berry, he's not a scientist, he's not taking a claim, sort of laying a stake here in the scientific domain, but he is, as a cultural historian, arguing that he thinks that we're not only witnessing and bringing about the end of the Holocene, which is already a big deal, he thinks we're bringing about the end of the Cenozoic, which is, of course, an even bigger deal. The Cenozoic started some 65 million years ago, probably because of a large asteroid ending the Mesozoic, right? And his argument, although he doesn't put it this way, is that right now we're the asteroid, is the claim. So he puts it this way: he thinks we're at a hinge moment, that we're witnessing and bringing about what he calls the terminal Cenozoic era, and that we have a choice whether to bring about the Technozoic or the Ecozoic. The Technozoic is this idea of trying to invent faster than the problem. It would embrace all the forms of geoengineering mentioned in the video, where we just simply try and mitigate the problem faster than creating it, which has kind of been our approach for the last couple hundred years. Importantly, in the Technozoic, technology and growth are the ends of human life. Like new technology and economic growth are the reason for human existence. They're the goal. So making them sustainable is the goal. The Ecozoic, a couple things about what it's not. First of all, it's not anti-technological. It's not sort of flying cars into the Jetsons up here and Mud Hudson Gruel down here. That's not the split here. Mud Hudson Gruel would be like, in here somewhere. The Ecozoic is a third option. It's not anti-technological, it's not romantic, it's not back to nature. It's rather just arguing that we should invent technologies and design economies as means, not as ends, as means to achieving the end of flourishing human communities within verdant communities of life. That's the purpose to which they should be put, is to become mutually beneficial as an integral whole with the systems of which we're a part. That's what he thinks the Ecozoic era would look like, and that's what he thinks our great work is to conceive of what that looks like. What would that be if we were to do that? And so, because, again, as advertised, huge nerd, now we've had Jetsons and Wall-E, and we've had Tolkien. Now imagine with me 3 Star Wars futures. Okay, so if the Technozoic goes really well, arguably what we end up with is Coruscant. Now, in the Star Wars universe, the Coruscant is a planet where the entire planet is just one city. There's no non-city. So amazingly, somehow, agriculture, food, waste, transportation, apparently this is possible. We've invented our way into creating this, and so this would be a successful Technozoic. No non-human stuff. We're just really, really good at it. If the Technozoic doesn't go super well, maybe we end up as moisture farmers on Tatooine. So that would be sort of a desiccated planet where we didn't invent our way out of the problem, and life is pretty hard, and Luke Skywalker's bummed about it. What about the Ecozoic? Right? What would you imagine that those futures would look like? Some of my environmental studies students think it might be Endor. That was the one with Ewoks. And that seems, as a philosopher, a little too rugged for me. I'm not really sure I want to live on Endor. It depends on your preference. Maybe Naboo, which seems to have large-scale human civilizations, but also lots of verdant nature. The point is, can we conceive of a form of genuine human living wherein we're mutually beneficial to the other ecosystems of which we're a part? And whatever that would look like, that would be what would be worthy of the name a fix or a better story to tell ourselves. That's a long, hard task, but at least if we did it, it would actually be good. Whereas those other formulations, they could be achieved, but they would still not necessarily be good, at least especially in the long future. So as I said at the top, how we define a problem determines what counts as a solution to the problem. So if we say climate change is the problem and it's a technical problem, and the goal is to make that sustainable, right? We have our path set for us. That seems to be where we're at right now. If we see it as not only a technical problem, but also in some ways as an ethical problem having to do with what we believe and what we are, then climate change isn't so much the problem as a symptom of the problem, and that the solution is a lot more demanding as well. One last riff here at the end, because some of you might be nodding your head and thinking this all sounds pretty good, but it seems really idealistic, and so I want to consider that directly, because I think it's a really fair concern. You might point out, we've got urgent problems. What does it look like to sort of do this great murky sort of stuff that the philosopher is talking about? It's too idealistic, and your ideals maybe are nice, but it's just too idealistic. We need to be hard realists, and that's an understandable sort of thing to say. But I would suggest that although we frequently oppose idealism and realism, I am of the view that they are not actually opposed at all. That there's a false dilemma because we misunderstand what ideals are. Ideals aren't beneficial because they're achievable. That's not their value or their purpose. Ideals are valuable because they define what counts as progress, what counts as success. They're the measuring stick relative to which we can even say this is good or this is bad, this is better or this is worse. It's only because we have that standard that we're even able to say that we made progress. And progress is, by definition, realistic. The question is not then whether or not we need ideals. The question is whether or not we have a sufficiently good one. There's this famous essay, Breakthrough Institute by Schellenberger and Nordhaus, and I don't agree with much of their piece, The Death of Environmentalism, but I do find really interesting their claim that the environmental movement has failed in part because it has not done something that the civil rights movement did do. It has always been really clear about what it's against, but not been sufficiently clear about what it's for. It's been clear that it's against air pollution and against water pollution and against species extinction and passed great laws in order to be able to fight against those things. And those are all good things to be against, but it hasn't been sufficiently clear about what it's for. And they contrast that with the civil rights movement, where Dr. King was really clear about what he was against, Jim Crow, segregation, racism, but he didn't really stop there, right? He didn't be like, and in addition to calling out all those forms of injustice, he also, of course, famously depicted this beautiful dream. And I would suggest that it's been generations of people who are fighting and dying to try and bring about this idealistic, beautiful dream, not because they think like we're going to get a perfect society, but because they want to have more of it rather than less of it. It's defining what success looks like. They're like, I want more of that. I want more of that as much as possible. Or to give two rather different examples, one from the Dalai Lama and one from Thich Nhat Hanh, both Buddhist monks. I rather like Thich Nhat Hanh's version of this, right? When you're lost and you don't know where to go, it's really useful to find the North Star. Not because you expect to get there, but because it gives you your orientation, and that's about as practical and realistic and useful as one can get, unless you're trying to get too Polaris, in which case. So ideals are like that, right? There are North Stars, and they're useful not because they're achievable, but because they define our orientation. They define which way we should be headed. Or to use a geometric example, think of it like an asymptote. which can approach a limit but never reach it. So if you think of the limit as the ideal and your actions like the line approaching it, you can never reach the ideal, but you can certainly be closer to it or farther away from it. And it's only relative to that limit that you can actually define closer and farther away. And in that way, it's really realistically and usefully defining what progress and success, regress, looks like. So we mistakenly and falsely oppose idealism and realism, in part, I think, because we, for some reason, are happy to let the status quo have its ideals count as realistic. That the status quo's ideals of happiness through infinite consumption, safety through the threat and use of violence are ideals. But because of the status quo's ideals, they get to be defined as realistic by default because of the status quo's. Instead, I would suggest that realistically what we should do is always be considering what are the ideals relative to which you're judging your success. Are they in fact good? And if so, what practically do they require of you? So to conclude, I want to take a shot at my friend Bill McKibben, who's a climate activist from started 350.org, really excellent human being. Wrote this great piece, I think this was, I didn't put the citation, apologies, I think it was in the Atlantic, arguing that we need a world war effort against climate change. And lays out a really interesting case that what he means here is the level of mobilization that we had during World War II of all of society is the level of activity we need. And he's not wrong. But I would argue that this is not an ideal that is going to be sufficient to sustain the multi-generational project we have in front of us. He wrote a book called Earth with 2 A's. I don't know how you pronounce it. And his argument at the end of the book was that what we need is a graceful decline, which is about as uninspiring of let's suck slowly together was sort of how he ended. And I understand why, but what we need is actually a positive vision. Now, Schoenberger and Nordhaus's point is that environmentalism has failed to have a positive vision for the future it's trying to create. It's clear about what it's against, but what is it for? What is it trying to create together? And this is where I think the great work idea from Barry is helpful. Yes, it's an ideal. The question is it a good one? Is it inspirational? Would it motivate us to want to try and fight to bring it about? And so it's a different metaphor to end on. Gonzaga has a wonderful campus in Florence, Italy, and this is the Duomo in Florence. And I think about the great cathedrals, and don't push this analogy too hard because it'll fall apart, but you know, these great cathedrals took sometimes centuries to create, and the person who laid the cornerstone rarely saw its completion. And I think of that as the work we have in front of us in terms of climate change. It's going to be a multi-generational project, and it's only going to be successful if we have an inspirational, idealistic vision of a future which, if we were lucky enough to create it, would actually be good to sustain that multi-generational project. So if you're interested in checking out any more, this is this 2015 popular book, and basically this was a condensed version of the last few chapters of that. And I think I'll end there and take questions.
Thank you very much. As usual, we'll start off with questions from students. If anyone has any questions or comments or we've learned to wait until it becomes sort of uncomfortably impatient for.
They teach us that at professor school.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a tipping point where like it's more uncomfortable to not say something.
Hi, I loved your talk, by the way. Great job, and it was very fascinating. You talked about, again, you ended on this concept that we need to not only have what we're fighting against or what we're fighting for, in your mind, whose responsibility is it to be the person who stewards that or comes up with that idea to present to people and then promote that? I mean, is it scientists? Is it philosophers? Is it governments? Because obviously having one singular vision of what we're fighting for then kind of narrows the pin, and which is great and helps visualize what we're fighting for, but then also can divide people if they disagree with that vision. So, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really fair question. So to repeat it back to make sure I'm catching your question, and sort of who, if you were to agree with my premise, then what? Who is responsible for crafting, fighting, pushing for this? Is it scientists, philosophers, government? One of my undergraduate professors used to say most ideas that are proposed, and he was talking about in particular the publications of philosophers, sink to the bottom without a ripple. So they, and this is the category of work that I write, is it goes out into the world and sinks to the bottom without a ripple, meaning has no effect whatsoever. But every now and then, an idea comes about and it grips people, and they end up fighting for it and about it, and it takes on a life of its own. It's decentralized. Its power is in the efficacy and evocativeness of the idea itself, of the vision itself. So you think about the vision that the civil rights movement depicts. The fights are no less today, maybe even, well, I'll just say no less today than they were then, about what is it we're fighting for? What does that future look like? And what does it require of us now? What exactly is equality? Is still being fought over. So it's not that that goes away, it's that we focus, at least part of the conversation, on that too. What worries me most is we just really spend all of our time talking about the technical and almost nothing about the sort of philosophical, conceptual, the worldview sort of part is left out. So it's not that we can do one over the other. We have to do the technical in order to even have an opportunity to do the conceptual. And whether the conceptual is going to be effective is not going to be based upon something I write, for sure. But some people are good messengers. I kind of wish that Bill McKibben would become like a, this is a weird, probably inappropriate thing to say, like a green Martin Luther King. You know, like we need somebody who can be visionary and create the right kind of what King called creative tension. But either the ideas are persuasive or they're not. You can't really control it, as much as it pains me to say as a philosopher like you. I can make a compelling argument that you could agree to, but that has nothing to do with whether you act on it. That has everything to do with whether you find it to be persuasive enough that you want to bring it about in your life and in your community, in your family. And so then it's the power of the idea. Some people think of it then as the field of the history of ideas, or why and when do ideas affect the trajectory of human living. And so it's a hard, I don't know how to control it, but that it's happening is sort of obvious to me. If you look at 20th century history, like it's just examples of ideas coming up and then wars being fought. It's really simplistic, but it's not completely false either. And so do we have the right ideas on the table? That's what worries me. And I feel like we don't. I feel like, for example, debating over 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius limit is super helpful and important in motivating political action, and yet we could achieve the impossible, and I think it is impossible now. We're talking about 1.5 degrees now. It seems really hard to imagine limiting ourselves to. But that's like a weak ideal, right? That's sort of like we've already have all these species extinction running, but all these massive storms, so many people suffering and dying. Like, one of the things I like about 350.org is built on James Hansen's idea of the parts per million concentration we should have in the atmosphere in order to have something resembling a Holocene climate. So we should go back to 350, where we're at 420, did you say? 425? What's the ideal? And I think we just have really anemic ideals. And that, as a philosopher, that worries me a lot.
Unless there's another stupid question.
Follow up on that, or?
No. Okay, I don't know how to ask this super well, so I'm just gonna go for broke here. So this is a pretty white Western focus on how we define the problem. And I think one of the things that MLK did really well was sort of coalition building across groups of people. So my question for you is, and maybe it just doesn't come out in this talk, is where are the voices of, for example, Indigenous people who are already part of the biotic community, who culturally care about this sort of stuff already? And how do we kind of, you know, for you, do you envision that as part of this sort of solution, if you will, where you're thinking about this moral problem? Like, who's actually at the table deciding what morality is in that context, and who sort of pays for things versus not? Because that was a little lost on me here, where you're seeing a lot of philosophers and other folk who are largely, again, white Western men in that context. And part of the reason I think we actually have this problem is because of that focus on what matters, right? Who's been doing the deciding of what matters. So what are your thoughts on that very broad question?
It's a really fair question as well. So Barry, although was a white guy, was a cultural historian, sort of interested in world cultures of all sorts, including, and maybe even especially indigenous traditions. So had a lot of respect and interest in them, but was still himself at the table as a white guy. A couple of different examples and thoughts that occurred to me. So one is emphasis in our environmental justice conversations, not only who bears disproportionate benefits and burdens, which is a really important part of environmental justice, but also the equal access to participatory forms of democracy, who's at the table. So when the Climate Institute is doing its work around extreme heat or wildfire smoke, and we're hosting events, one of the things we've been trying to do is to use the resources that we can accumulate to create ways of funding community members to attend who wouldn't be able to otherwise, paying for daycare or for transportation or just lost labor. And so creating opportunities for community members who traditionally would have been more disenfranchised, not part of those conversations about saying, you know, what do we want, what is the future we're trying to create, so that they have their stories and their views have an opportunity to influence the outcome. Second thought would be for me personally, is to look at the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer and braiding sweetgrass. It was so inspiring to me because she's an example of a Western-trained botanist, but she's also a member of the Potawatomi Nation, and so she finally gave me an example of what it would look like to bring these together in a way that does both justice and the result is better. And so I just want to say, like, do the Kimmerer thing as much as we can of what it would look like, because she, too often prior to reading her work, it seemed like I had trouble imagining how to bring, they just seemed like you pick one, which doesn't seem right. And so if you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass, take a look at her book. Fantastic. So mostly just to agree with you and to think of examples of how and when to do that, because the last third comment would just be the danger of romanticism is real, and so like how do you avoid also romanticizing, especially a particular time period of an indigenous community's life is hard. So when I'm working with communities in our neighborhood, which were salmon people in the inland Northwest, it's really interesting and hard. How do we lift up their stories without taking their stories and without, it's really so I haven't figured out how to do this effectively. I'm just, as a white guy, I'm just like terrified, but also like you have to wade into those sort of opportunities. How do you give them opportunities to share their stories and advocate for their views? Is as best I can do, and I'm doing it with fear and trembling all the time because I'm worried about also doing it a disservice and doing some violence to it at the same time.
If you feel comfortable in it, you've already lost the game.
So I'm definitely not comfortable, so but trying.
Thank you.
Good questions? The one that, yeah, go ahead, Rudra.
Sorry, I'm still trying to frame a question in my head, so I'm just going to say it out loud. But part of your argument was that the limitations of sustainability is because it's too much human-centric. concept. Like it's about the growth of humans, but I think that tangentially it also affects the ecology and ecosystems. It's kind of baked in to some of the solutions that are coming up, but I'm trying to understand that how to tease out, like any technological advancement, I think has some sort of advertisement at how it's good for ecology and ecosystems and not just humans. So are we on the right track already, or we are not, and it should be a primary concern and not a tertiary concern?
If and when it becomes a primary concern, I guess I'd say we're on the right track. So it's not a technology good, technology bad. It's for what, right? And so I was talking with a retired professor before the talk, and worked in soils, and he was talking about restorative agriculture. So there's technological aspects to restorative agriculture. It's not that it's like technology versus not technology. It's for what though, and what, so you're growing food for humans, but it's also creating biotic communities that are richer for those as well. So maybe I'm missing your question though. I feel like maybe I'm missing. Are we just agreeing? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, and that's why I said that I'm trying to frame the question as well. But my question would be that, is the current development path that we're having, is that already on the right track towards a more I forgot the word.
Ecozoic, yeah.
Ecozoic, or?
Some aspects of it I think are, yeah. So the sustainability is just such a broad term. I really am lambasting sort of the rather superficial business economics sort of versions of it, and which are really relatively, they're very thin. And so as long as you can internalize all the externalities, you've done your work. And I'm just like, no, that's not really enough necessarily. So there are technologies which, so the idea of restorative technologies is maybe a good way of putting it. There are technologies which control and dominate. They try and control, like the geoengineering is a good example, right? You're trying to control now the entire planet. And maybe we can do that, maybe we can't. Like, are we smart enough? I don't know. I'm worried about that, but like, it's certainly, the point is, it's an attitude of like, what we need to do is just control it more. And if we can just control it enough, that we can, and the other attitude is, how do we, it's like more like biomimicry, or how do we, like, how do we work with and as part of a biotic community, as a member, for the good of all the members of the community. Then how do we design those kinds of technology? They would also be sustainable, so we, hopefully, meaning they can be done indefinitely. But I just want to suggest, by itself, sustainability is just neutral. It's just like things that can be done indefinitely. So I want the focus to be on, how do we know what's good? What should we make sustainable?
It's just like the means and the end paradigm of sustainability is more just a means towards an end, which we've not defined yet.
That's right. The end gets to be quiet, right? And it's just sort of like, it's, keep paying your credit card bill indefinitely. That's like the quiet aim. It's like, as long as you keep getting to buy stuff indefinitely as a good consumer.
Yeah, so sustainability may be a way of a means towards an end that we don't actually think is good.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. So making the end, making the status quo defend itself a little more, like, what is the end relative to which we're measuring success? Is it actually good if we were actually cheap for people and for the planet? I'm not sure. Right? That's sort of when we lift it up, I think it's pretty clear that it's not particularly good enough. Yes?
My continuation of that line of thought is when you have that split of technozoic versus ecozoic,
Yeah.
you have technology and economy as being a means in one and being an end in the other. And my thought would be that technology and growth, or technology and economies and growth, this is always a mean, and what the end is something that is not always well defined. And if you define growth as the end, to me that seems like if you are the people currently in power that want it to stay that way, then it is the end, because now you don't have to define a new end. Your end is keeping the status quo versus defining a new and different end. So in my head, like those, like technological advancement is always something that is going to happen as long as humans are curious. But what we are advancing, what we are keeping up with, is defined by what those end goals are.
Well said. In a slightly longer version of this, I have a set of slides at the end also on what does this mean for education. So imagining this talk, but then ending it on what are we educating for, or toward what are we educating, and how would we find success. And if we just define success as how rich our alumni are, it's probably not, well, you're going to be scientists, never mind, you won't have that problem. But it's a similar sort of, how do we measure, what would education be for if it was an ecozoic education? What would that look like? Brad is not.
All right, so